Well, welcome back to the Azure Podcast. This is episode number 514, being recorded on the 5th of March, 2025, with special guest Mario Hewardt. On Teams with me, we have Cynthia, Evan, Cale, and of course our special guest Mario. Normally we'd have some news that we discuss before we get our guests involved, but it looks like it's been a dry week over here, and I know we did a lot of news updates the last week when we did our show, so I think we were kind of caught up with most of the news anyways. So today we're going to go straight into our topic of discussion, which I'll let Mario sort of tee up for us. So Mario, please go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell us what you do in Azure, and kind of we'll take it from there.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me on. I'm Mario Hewardt, and I'm an engineering manager on the Sysinternals team under the Azure Office of the CTO. I've been at Microsoft, I don't know, I think you stop kind of counting after 25 plus years. and most of my career has been around, my bread and butter has been around diagnostics and debugging. And so I've spent a lot of times in the field working with customers. Sujit and I worked together for a bit, and then now I'm working on the actual diagnostics tools. So yeah, thanks for having me.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, the Sysinternals obviously, safe to say, is the most popular set of tools
Just used it last
uh,
week.
that has ever been built. Yeah, literally everybody, no matter if you're a newbie in the Microsoft ecosystem or someone who's been around for a while, you know about Sysinternals, and the tools are so useful. And for me, what I find amazing is that they are constantly being updated. I don't know, I know, I'm glad to see that there's, a team that you're heading out that's kind of managing all of that. But, every time I see like a Mark, or I guess it was Bryce, who was the other authors,
hmm
you occasionally would put out updates, I was like, how do they find the time? And, it's like, oh, yeah, here's something cool. It's like, it does all this stuff. Yeah, so to tell us about, maybe a little bit of structure about your team, and like, what's the charter is like, and how, and what are you guys looking at these days in terms of the tooling? Obviously you kind of inherited this code, which is, how old is the code now? 25 years old?
You know, y- yeah, we was it 2 years ago? I want to say we had that special Sysinternals 25th event. So yeah, 25 years. It's
There
it's
you go.
it's been around. It's been around for a while. Yeah. So in terms of the actually kind of an interesting thing, Azure Office CTO is obviously headed up by Mark Rusanovich, and he is the Azure CTO. We released a new version of Zoom It. I don't know if you all are familiar with that.
Yep.
And about a couple of months ago, and it's this cool feature where today you can zoom in and do annotations like text and drawing and all that kind of cool stuff. The background though is a static um, background depending on what you zoomed on. So we implemented live draw, which means that you can zoom in, and if something is happening in the background, you can just keep annotating and it will do live desktop updates. So going to your point where it's like these tools are still being evolved, etc. Mark literally wrote that code. So he's not just active in the sense that I kind of want to know what you guys are thinking about Sysinternals, but he actually just sat down. He implements code. He checks in code for Sysinternals too, which is pretty awesome to see from a CTO level. But our team is we have 3 people, so it's not a big team, but and we kind of split our time a little bit. First and foremost, we want to make sure that our customers that are using our existing tools are happy with them, and making sure that whatever critical bugs and things like that get fixed. But we also, of course, try to innovate as much as we can, and some examples of that has been around our move over to other platforms. Like Sysinternals has been canonically Windows, but now we have some tools for Linux, and I guess 2 or 3 months ago we released our first tool for the Mac OS. That was ProcDump, so that was kind of fun. But yeah, we we split our time that way. We're a pretty agile team. Like that's really important for us. If we think that, hey, this would be kind of a nice or cool thing to do, we jump on it and we try it out right away. That's a pretty important pillar for us. So that's kind of at a high level how we think about things as a team.
Mario, I'm first curious about your background on your team's background. What is that? Could you explain to us and to our listeners that don't necessarily see it yet? And other question is in terms of telemetry, are users always connected to the network when they use this internal tools? And then how does your team look at telemetry when, I don't know, I can imagine how telemetry is collected when we talk about an Azure service or like Office 365, but for Sysinternals, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my team's background is because Microsoft is turning 50 years old this year. I don't remember anyone remember is it April something?
8th of
April.
Did I see that?
April.
Yeah, it's coming up though soon, I think, because there's big events planned. I've started seeing hints of.
Yeah. So that's a really cool. It's a really cool thing. In terms of the telemetry, is a great question. Telemetry has become, or anything connected and phoning home has become more and more sensitive, right? And rightfully so. Now the Sysinternals tools across the board, they do not by design send anything back for telemetry. So we have zero outside obviously of downloads, but outside of that we don't have any telemetry in terms of how it's being used. That is by design for two reasons. One is it is a very sensitive thing, especially when you're running in lockdown production environments that may not even have outbound connectivity, but even if they do, it's very, very controlled. And so having telemetry there is typically something that gets frowned upon. And our tools are very often used in prod environments just by the nature of how the tools are designed, right? They're meant to be lightweight, small. They're X-copyable exes that you can just move around at will. You don't have to run an installer or anything like that. And that is super important for when you're talking about lockdown prod environments. So a great question. Like we don't send any telemetry at all. Which, there's a flip side to that. Telemetry can be very, very helpful, obviously, in terms of figuring out how and what people are using. But the primary thing for us is making sure that our customers can solve their problems without having any hurdles in the way.
I feel, I sort of feel like a little bit like I feel once in a while when somebody runs into, a listener to the show runs into me and they're like, oh, long-time listener. I'm a long-time user of Sysinternals, I'm in support. And, to your point, right, they're in use tremendously across the world, across the scenarios, across the products. But I think I don't know that I had paid attention because I had gone off to do Azure Platform Lifesite for a number of years, that y'all went multi-platform. At some point, like that what was that experience like? Because, because you can't, because you need to be X-copyable, you can't leverage some of the portability of the .NET framework and whatnot, and not to mention the fact that I'm assuming you don't have the same level of access to the core developers that you do when you're working on the Windows platform. How some of these things are non-trivial to go figure out on the Linux, environment or Mac. I mean, you may be looking at the code, but reading it is not quite the same always as understanding exactly what you're trying to do with it. So what was that experience like trying to go cross-platform?
Yeah, that was interesting. Is that the right word? Well, so to give you a little bit of kind of background on that, I was in services. This was, I want to say maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Yeah. And the thing that kind of kept me up at night was when we were thinking about Azure, is we had this freight train coming barreling. I was already at the station, right? Microsoft had embraced the idea, and it's a great way of approaching it. Like, we meet our customers where they are, and Linux started growing like crazy on Azure. because Linux is a
Yeah,
great
it's been
operating
more than
system.
50% for years and
Yeah.
years now. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been really great, but that also kind of those 6 or 7 years ago kept me up at night, because I was like, we've been giving this great service and services to our customers, and it's all been the Microsoft stack. Now, how do we extend the same level of service now that they're bringing Linux or other workloads? So that's how I kind of got started on that. And because my brain always goes to diagnostics and debugging, I started thinking about the Sysinternals tools, right? Like, what can we do there to help that ecosystem and help also our own engineers be able to give the same level of service. So that's kind of how we got started. And after that, I went to Mark and I said, hey, I've been thinking about that. And he kind of gave the green light to go and try out a tool. And so we chose Procdump. And that was successful. Like, one thing that I think is really important here is that our team, and when it comes to cross-platform, we have a very we have multiple, but what core sort of principle of that team is, if what we're thinking about porting or implementing on Linux from Sysinternals doesn't actually plug a gap and it kind of already exists, we don't touch it. Like, we don't want to go in and say, yeah, we know that it's already solved, but let's solve it the Microsoft way. Like, that's not what we want to do at all.
Yeah.
And so Procdump, it turned out to be really successful because it did actually plug a gap that was needed there. And so the other principle is we want to make sure that it feels like it's born in Linux. We don't want necessarily have, there are philosophical differences between the operating systems, and we want to make sure that the tool feels native to that platform. But after that, in terms of like the challenges when it came to actually implementing it, I'll give you a concrete example. Like, we take Windows perf counters for granted, right? They're there, right? And we use them all the time.
Yeah, it's how you trigger some of the memory dumps when you're using Procdump, right? It's a core scenario. Yeah,
that's exactly it. And so, before I started down this path, the last time I had used Linux was in college, so it was a while. So I was just kind of assuming, well, there's got to be some maybe the API is called Linux perf counter or something like that. They don't exist at all. Like, they don't have those APIs. So those kind of things that, coming from a long Windows background, having to readjust a little bit. I mean, they obviously have something equivalent. You could use procfs to go and get all those counters. It's all text because everything on Linux is a file and all that kind of stuff. So you can find them and you can, we haven't come across a scenario yet that we have in Windows that we can't do in Linux. But to your point, it's very, very different. And that was a little bit of a mind shift difference. I mean, that was coming off of 20 years of low-level Windows stuff. And so shifting over to a new operating system was a little hard, but it's also a lot of fun, right? I mean, it's learning a new modern operating system and being able to put it in context of super useful tools was amazing.
That leads to sort of a follow-up question, in that, are these actually forked code bases to some extent, or is there a bunch of pound ifs, scattered throughout the code to try and get it to work across the board? Like, how complicated is really servicing those two, I guess three now, very different platforms?
Yeah, good question. So we, the Linux versions are forks. There's
okay.
Well, okay, it gets a little complicated. By and large, they are forks. So, for example, Procdump is a new implementation on Linux versus Windows. Now, having said that, we did make sure that, because the other thing besides plugging a gap for this tool on Linux, it's also an opportunity for our engineers, that also other engineers that have been living and breathing Windows for so long, to take the first steps towards Linux in a familiar environment, right?
Yeah.
And so there are some parts of the code base that might be kind of common, but they're not the same in the sense that it's just one source file with a whole bunch of ifdefs.
Yeah. Okay.
For Sysmon for Linux, it's a little different. Like, we did encapsulate or factor out a common code base from Windows, and we have that as a module on Git or GitHub. So both the Windows and the Linux versions use that common module.
Right. Okay.
And then lastly, going back to procdump for Linux, which now exists on Mac. While the Linux version is forked from Windows, the Mac version is in fact a whole bunch of ifdefs in the Linux code base.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's a little bit of a combination.
You had to redo like the whole pipeline at this point
Yes.
to really be able to migrate those up. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's been. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Cale.
No, I was going to say, along with that, follow-up question again is Azure itself, right? I'm interested, like, so Sysinternals, I remember working with that before there was Azure. And so it's like, how did Azure influence it? Like, obviously there's a lot of Windows running in Azure, right? If we have a VM or something very basic like that, easy to use these tools, install them, or just use them in that environment. But like PaaS services and things like that, I'm interested, like, did that influence things in Sysinternals over the years, and how have they changed to help Azure, diagnostics?
Yeah, no, so that's a good question. In the terms of in terms of Azure, I think there's a couple of different things. As end users of Azure and potentially Sysinternals, what I like to say is like a bug is a bug is a bug, or like maybe we'll call it a problem is a problem is a problem. Whether you're running it on-prem or if you're running it in the cloud, you're still going to need some sort of diagnostics tool to figure it out. And getting the best diagnostics tool for your scenario is going to mean the difference between figuring out in 5 minutes or still working on it 4 weeks from now. So from that regard, when we think about Sysinternals, end user can use them in Azure all day long, right? If you're in IS scenarios, you're running VMs or whatever, you can do that just as much as you're doing an on-prem. In terms of the managed services, like the PaaS services, there are integration points that we have had with different parts of Azure where we're exposing Sysinternals type of data out of those services. So it's not necessarily that we give you an option within whatever PaaS service that you're using, click here and run Sysinternals Procmon, but there's some shared knowledge and things like that enable information to be bubbled up. So that's kind of from the end user perspective. Internally in Azure, we're also using our Sysinternals tools quite heavily. So when you think about one of our popular tools in Sysinternals, right, is procdump, which allows you to go and say, hey, monitor this process for something to happen, and when it does, generate a core dump. And that's really, really important in production scenarios because you don't have the luxury to be like, hey, let's install Visual Studio and live debug this thing, right? So procdump, the Sysinternals procdump tool, is now pretty much running across the entire Azure fleet as being the de facto standard for collecting postmortem data for problematic processes on Azure. So that's kind of one example where the Sysinternals tool has impacted all of Azure. There are other parts of Azure, like the platform that at a high level kind of runs M365 and all that. We worked with them recently to enable procdump for Linux as being sort of a first-class part of their diagnostics platform when things go wrong there as well. Let's see here some other examples. Well, we all know about the importance behind our SFI initiative, this Secure Future initiative, obviously. So parts of the Sysinternals code base is now running internally within those systems to bubble up really important information in terms of things that could be interesting to look at from that perspective. So both from an end user perspective to how we use it internally, it kind of crosses the spectrum on both. So does that help, or there's more sort of, or can I help with more detailed kind of stuff?
No, that's interesting because, I wasn't looking for, we have some tools for Azure where we say, oh, connect to Azure, connect to your storage account and do these kind of things. But these are a little bit lower level tools. And that's why I was curious, like, as we built out Azure, where we saw it fit and make sense. Like you said, we integrated it into some pieces of it to help. So, yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. And there's, sorry.
Mario probably knows this, but I have worked with service teams who some of these Sysinternal tools are sitting in their, little debug folder that goes on all their images.
Yeah.
Right. So it's absolutely used,
Mm-hmm.
as an explicit part of that platform.
And that's what I was going to ask, right? If customers are deploying, I mean, VMs, okay, I guess that's an easy option, right? You could, I guess, install extensions or whatever in VMs that have all of the tools there. But if you are deploying like an AKS or maybe even an app service plan or something like that, right? And you want to say, hey, if my process dies in the app service plan, I want to know about it, right? I want to see whether I caused that problem or was it a Microsoft problem. This is what the customer might think, right? And they want to have some of this tooling in there. Is that possible to deploy to these kind of more managed services like AKS and PaaS, like Microsoft has? Because it's not a whole lot you can kind of slip in there, but at the same time, customers do want to have that visibility. So what are the options there?
Yeah. So in terms of the if we're talking about K8s, for example, Kubernetes, right? You can definitely, and as part of our collaboration with the team at Microsoft that runs M365, there was a set of and that's all sort of Kubernetes, and not all, but some of it is Kubernetes based. And so part of that work, we discovered that there were some deficiencies in Procdown for Linux that we had to address. So there was a great collaboration that way, in the sense that we were able to get it up and running in a Kubernetes environment. So to your point there, you can absolutely do that. Now Kubernetes does allow some flexibility in terms of what you can run, and our tools can be part of that. Now, if you go to a fairly locked down managed service, it's where we don't have the ability to get and put something on the system, then you're going to have a harder time. But those managed services oftentimes will have their own diagnostics implemented, some of which may be driven by Sysinternals under the covers. So
right, but like adding it to a container, for example, is that an option if you just want to add it to like a Docker, a Linux image or something like that?
Okay. As a matter of fact, if anyone's interested in that, right, you can go and look at on Medium. I wrote Sysinternals Procdown for cloud native applications, and that explains exactly how you can get that set up. Yeah.
I think majority of what we talked about right now is using Sysinternals when something wrong happens. Has there been a way or a direction of detecting these anomalies or detecting these patterns? So I also know we also just talked about there's no telemetry collected. So is there a way in the future where Sysinternals will tell us preemptively that we're about to get the blue screen, for example?
Yeah. That one will be actually pretty cool. You're about to blue screen. Yeah. So I think
it'll ship next week, Cynthia. Exactly. Once Mario goes and thinks about it overnight.
The last year we did kind of a because at Microsoft we have the hackathon week, right, where we get to go off and do some cool stuff that may not necessarily be related to your day-to-day thing. And last year we did that on Sysinternals, and we started experimenting a little bit with this thing called AI. So what we did is, to your point, we took Process Explorer, and just for clarity and full context, this isn't something that's shipped yet, right? But we took Process Explorer and we said, because oftentimes the scenario for Process Explorer is you just run it in the background and it just sits there and does its thing. And then once in a while you're like, oh man, like my system seems like it's doing something weird. Let me bring up Process Explorer. You look at the processes and maybe you start investigating. So what we wanted to do was say, can Process Explorer, because it sits there and just collects and collects and collects, can it use some of that data, run it through whatever anomaly detection models that we come up with, and proactively tell you that, hey, it looks like potentially this process may become very problematic in the near future. So maybe, and here it is, and maybe you should take a look at it. And for the hackathon, it was scoped, right? So we just wanted to prove some things out. So we used kind of CPU and some other dimensions on that. And it actually turned out to work pretty well. Like we got it to a point where it popped a toast and said, this process is problematic, and we hacked up a problematic process because that's That's how I write code, and yeah, no, it worked really well. So I think we're actually going to continue on that. Like I said, last year was a little bit of like let's tease some things out, let's learn some new things, and let's see what we can do in this upcoming year in terms of enabling that.
Yep. And
But
Sysinternals. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead. No,
No, I was just remembering that Sysinternals, if I recall, is all C++ code, right? Isn't that? It's for the most. Is there? It's all C++, right? It's. I don't think there's anything that's like managed code or something like that. And so this is pretty. This code has to run efficiently and without causing additional problems if, especially we're going to run on every Azure service out there or as, every Windows server out there. I'm just curious, like, what's the kind of rigor that goes into to putting out some of these changes? I mean, I don't think there's not a public GitHub repo for Sysinternals, right? It's essentially closed source code. Am I correct? Did I miss that? And just wondering, like, how that sort of review is done.
Yeah. So our Windows code base is closed source. Our Linux code base is fully open source on GitHub, so that you can go and check out. About 2 months ago, we took one of our Windows tools and open source it by virtue of adding it to PowerToys for Windows. So Zoomit is now open source. If you go to the GitHub repo, you can get to the Zoomit source code. If you're just interested in looking at it, or it's fully open source. So if you're ever like, man, I wish Zoomit had this feature, wink, wink. And it is the vast majority of it is C++. There is a tool, RDCman, that's .NET. We're actually working on, or one of the developers, Alex, is working on making big changes to RDCman, and as part of that, moving to modern.NET and all that, but it is managed code. We're working also on auto runs for Linux, which is going to be brand new. That's not going to be written in C and C++. That will be written in Rust. So going to some of the things that you were saying, like, hey, it's got to have a low footprint, it's got to be efficient performing, because if you go to an unhealthy system and say, in order to diagnose this, I'm going to need to use 10% more resources, that's not going to work. And so Rust obviously is famous for being a much safer memory safety perspective language, and still being able to afford the luxury of speed and performance and all that footprint. So that's where we're at with that one. But we're always kind of looking at things, and we'll see. Like, we have Sysinternals tools today that, like, do they need to be written in like the assembly language because they need to be so fast? Probably not. And maybe if we have tools like that, we take a different approach. Where, like I said, we're pretty agile. We go and try to figure out what the right thing to do is.
One question I had, Mario, too, and I don't know if you can share it, but I'll ask anyway, is I know when Mark started working with Windows and things a long time back, it was from the outside in, right? So he had no internal, like, access to things like Windows source code and things like that in order to start doing some of that stuff. And I've heard him talk, about that in the past. I guess my question is, as Sysinternals has evolved and there's like a huge catalog of tools you can use there now, is there a tighter relationship with the Windows team now? Do you guys work hand in hand, meaning like when Windows 12 comes and there's this whole new API, you guys have a heads up and you're working towards that? Or is it more like on an as-needed basis, like you just have a use case where, oh, wish we could diagnose this thing now and this, we should build a tool for it, or augment what we have,
Yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe a couple of things on that. One is, we do work with the Windows team, and it's not so much that, hey, tell us what APIs are coming up, but when we're low-level system tools, as you said, like it was the outside in, a lot of things were reverse engineered, and so oftentimes in those scenarios, we sometimes hit some interesting bugs or corner cases, and so we work closely with the Windows
bugs.
team. Yeah. So we work closely with the Windows team with that, and as part of that, it's just a natural thing. Like, hey, yes, but you all are using this API. Have you tried using this new API that's come out since then? And you look at that and you realize that opens up a whole new world in that particular scenario. So, so that's kind of one way that we're doing it. And outside of that, for us, it's more like it would be super cool if our tools could do this or that, and then we go and explore. And an example of this is a couple of years ago we added video or screen recording to Zoom It, and I mean we had no idea like what. Last time I did screen recording was on Windows was a long time ago, and there was really nothing. But as you sort of went through that exercise and like what is available in Windows today, turns out that there are screen capture APIs. There are all kinds of new things that we could use. So it's kind of driven from both sides of things, if that helps. Yeah. But we have a great relationship with Windows, and we work with them all the time.
So I think we should I'll ask a question in kind of closing here. You talked about, I think Cynthia first asked about getting feedback, how you don't really get telemetry. But how do you get feedback, to understand what you want to do in the tool, and also how do you get bugs reported to you? Like if customers are going to use this on Azure and maybe they hit some sort of niche corner in Azure which doesn't work, the tool doesn't work or misbehaves. What's the sort of reporting option that they have?
So we have if we're looking at the Windows, so let's start with the Linux tools, right? They're all open source on GitHub. We do everything out in public. Like we don't have some weird secret ADO database in the background. If you get an issue, file it on GitHub, right? Or if you want to start a discussion or a dialogue, do it on GitHub. We also have Windows, of course, is closed source, but you can reach us either through like the Q&A, the Sysinternals Q&A site on Learn, or there's also Sysint at Microsoft.com. I believe you can send email, but the best bet is just doing it on the Q&A Sysinternals forum. You can also reach us at on Blue Sky, Threads, or X. That's kind of where when we publish new releases, of course, outside of the Sysinternals page itself, we announce those releases on those social media platforms. There is, if we still have time, there is one other kind of thing. So we talked about production environments, right? Sysinternals is great because it's locked down and you can get all this data that you can look at postmortem. So what we're working on right now, we're actually pretty close to releasing it. There is another scenario that's very similar to this, which is when you're doing your CI/CD pipelines in the cloud, right? So think about ADO, or you're doing your build pipeline and maybe you run some unit tests.
More important in some ways, right? Because you can get it ahead of time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you're running some integration tests or unit as part of your build, right? And something messes up. Like you don't have access to those machines. It's not like you can RDP into that public compute node that does all that. So we're working on the Sysinternals ADO extension, and that's going to allow you to run the Sysinternals tools. We're starting with procdump, right? So if you did have that integration test issue, you just tell procdump in your YAML pipeline that monitor this process, and when a trigger hits, it will dump and upload it to artifacts. And we want to expand on that as well, but we're starting with procdump to see how that goes. But it's a very similar scenario, just slightly different, but to your point, it's important. So it's important to be able to diagnose your pipelines too.
That is definitely nice to hear. Yeah, that would be very useful. I know a number of times when the pipeline just dies.
Yeah.
And typically, some build server, you can't get the logs and whatnot. So yeah, this would definitely be very, very useful. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that here.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Any more questions for Mario before we wrap up?
No, this is great. It's great to see the evolution. Like I said, I think the thing that really blew my mind after not looking or thinking about Sysinternals for a number of years was the multi-platform piece. That is a true indication of where we are as a world today, or as an industry today.
And I think just for me, kind of closing is, I think people oftentimes think like Sysinternals on-prem or whatever, but like I said, a problem is a problem is a problem, and wherever you're hosted, you're going to need to diagnose it. So, so this it's super important in the cloud space as well.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, Mario, and
Yeah,
for
thanks for
sharing
having
all
me.
these insights. It's been amazing.
Yeah. Thanks, Mario.
Absolutely. Thank you.